So you want to get that sexy new AR-15, but you're not sure whether you should build one or whether you should buy one. So in today's video, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about why you might want to consider buying your rifle and why you might want to consider building your rifle, or maybe even take a hybrid approach. I don't think there's necessarily one method that's better than the other, but I do have my own personal preferences, and I'll share that as we continue on in the video. I'll also wrap up by giving a real-world example of how you could put all these things together to make your decision of what you think is better. And to do that, we have, of course, the M16, if we focus, A4 clone, which I obviously love. It's in a little bit of a different configuration this time. I took the ACOG off, but the reason we're going to be using the M16 is one, because it's awesome, and two, because it's a really good example of a rifle you can buy out there today, and also one that you can build on your own pretty easily. So we're going to compare the two different options, in kind of like a real world scenario. So when you're deciding whether you want to build or buy a rifle, there's some considerations that you should keep in mind. So as you go through this, remember, what is your budget? So how much you're willing to spend on your gun? What are you going to use your gun for as well? Because that'll dictate obviously the types of guns you get, maybe the length of the barrel, certain features you like more, depending on whether it's a longer distance gun or a closer in kind of gun for maybe home defense. Then also one thing to consider too is how soon do you need this gun as well? Usually building your gun takes a little longer because there are more parts you need to source, and sometimes those are out of stock, but that can also apply to guns that are factory that you would buy as well. So just another thing to keep in mind. And then the last thing you also want to consider is that, do I want to spend the time to actually build the rifle? Not just actually putting it together, which does take its own set of skills, but also putting in the time to research what you need. I personally do advocate a little more for trying to build your rifle at one point or another, because it really teaches you the things that you have to learn about the gun. Different products that are available that may or may not be good for you, or just understanding how the gun works in the first place. And so that's another thing you also need to consider. Do I want to put in the time and effort to assemble the gun, both with the research perspective and then also the putting it together perspective as well? So let's get into it. Let's start with why you might want to consider building your rifle. Well, the biggest reason, if you ask me, why you might want to consider building your rifle is because you have more control over the final product. That really is the biggest thing, at least for me. Because you're choosing each individual part, you have the choice of what your final gun looks like, and so you can tailor it to how you want. As opposed to if you're buying your gun outright, yes, you can customize it after, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, but what you see is what you get, and so you don't have any control over the base rifle beyond obviously your decision to purchase it. So control is the biggest reason why usually you would want to build your rifle instead of just buy it. Now, when you're building your rifle, and especially if you're newer to this, you're going to come across pretty quickly a bunch of different products and product types. So for example, you might have a different barrel, or you might be looking at a certain barrel, but you might find beyond just the length and all that kind of stuff and the caliber, all those normal things, you'll find that the construction of them, maybe, with certain types of steel or certain types of rifling within them, are very different. And while I'm not going to go into the specifics of those, what I'm trying to highlight is that you will find there are many different variations of the same product, and it will be up to you to determine which ones you really need. Do you need the cold hammer forged barrel, or do you need just like the nitride coated barrel or whatever? They're two different coatings, but maybe depending on who you are and what you're using your gun for, you may or may not need one over the other, and that also has cost implications as well. Similarly for the AR-15, also when you look at the bolt carrier group, you will find that there are several different types of materials used, or strengths of materials used, and also coating as well. So you'll see like a phosphate coated bolt carrier group, or maybe a nitride coated one. You'll hear like Carpenter 158 steel, or I think it's like 4160 steel as well. All these things just refer to the way in which that the bulk carrier group has been made. And again, it's just more things that you need to research to understand, do I really need this, or can I just, is it really not necessary? All of this equates to time and patience in learning. I think it can, for some, be a little overwhelming at first, which it definitely was for me. I felt like I spent more time researching the parts than actually buying them, which maybe is obvious. But it's a path, it's a cliche, it's a path you go down to learn what's best for you. And it makes you more knowledgeable and informed too. And so as you're going through all of this, you're also going to learn not just which parts are out there, but also which parts are important to spend more money on, and which parts you can, maybe save a little bit of money on. So it's very common to know that the barrel and also the bulk carrier group, the two parts that I just mentioned, are considered some of the most critical components of the gun. Generally, you want to spend a little more to make sure you're getting something good, because if those break, your gun won't work. And so that's where you would want to focus most of your money on. And so that's just kind of understanding what is really important for you and where do you really need to make sure your rifle has quality components, as opposed to something like a safety selector switch, which I'm not saying isn't important, but probably isn't as crucial as the design of that as to the other components that I mentioned. So that's on the research part of things. Now, when you actually have your gun or the components of the gun and you need to put together, that's another portion too that does require some time and patience and effort on your behalf. Now, I would say assembling an AR-15 is not exactly very difficult, but you do need to have the right tools and you do need to have some skills in order to make the job done properly. And this can really vary based on, to what extent you want to build. Are you just going to change maybe some small parts in the lower receiver like the stock, or are you actually going to put the barrel into the lower receiver? Those require different sets of tools, and with that, it requires different sets of skills as well. I would say though, there's nothing to really get intimidated by. Don't let that stop you. I found that it's actually quite easy to do just once you get the hang of it. And think about it this way. There are how many AR-15s out there in the United States, and how popular is it to build your rifle? Incredibly popular. Millions of people probably are doing this. That means you can too. So don't let building your gun and maybe not having all the skills, don't let that be a deterrent. It's a really good process in my opinion. You will also learn the importance of quality tools and taking your time. You'll notice I come back to patience a lot. When you finally finish making your gun, or even before that in the process of making your gun, you will develop a pride of ownership of knowing that you've put the gun together yourself. And then hopefully you're happy with the craftsmanship of the parts when they actually arrive at your doorstep, but also in your ability to assemble the final product. For some people, they may not care about the whole pride of ownership and stuff, and they just want a working gun. But at least to me, when I've put together all my guns, I've always felt proud that I was able to do it, and it felt almost like I was more connected, or like the gun was more valuable to me than just a tool. It really was mine and personalized because I put in the time and the effort to do it, and the research as well. So that's another cool thing about building your gun that may apply to you. This isn't to say that you will always value your built guns more than your bought guns. My very first gun that I got was actually from the factory, and then I just added some more parts onto it, so it was kind of a hybrid, and I still really love that, my M4A1 clone that I've shown a lot. But still, it's just worth touching on the pride of ownership and your ability to, accomplish a goal as well. Now let's talk about buying your gun outright. Typically, you would want to buy your gun outright because what you've seen is already exactly what you want, and there's no need to go through all of the extra steps in order to get, the final product. It's a much more straightforward, simpler process. And another big benefit of buying a gun too, from the factory is that because it's been offered to so many people, you will have a lot of different data points, a lot of different reviews that you can look up to understand how good and how reliable is this product really. Many other people have bought the gun, so you will find the reviews through blogs, through YouTube or whatever, to really understand, what you're spending your hard-earned cash on. As opposed to if you were building a gun, yes, you can do reviews on each of the individual components, but I would argue it's just, that much harder to get a review because no one has, or few people have your exact same type of gun. Not the biggest deal, but it is something to call out as well. So overall, buying your gun tends to be a much more straightforward, simplistic process, but you don't have as much control over the final product, but you may have a little more predictability in what that product looks like. But that's not to say that building is a gamble at all. It absolutely is not. It's up to you to do your research, and all that information is out there. And I've built more of my guns than I have bought them from the factory. I mentioned a third approach earlier, which is kind of a hybrid approach, which is what I've done for some of my guns. Basically, you buy the base gun from the factory, and then you swap out some parts just as you want. So with my M4A1 clone, that's what I did. I bought that Daniel Defense from the factory, then I switched out certain parts in the lower receiver just to make it look like a kind of gun that I wanted. I'm not sure if I would really consider that building your gun at that point, but that's semantics. The point is that there's a hybrid approach. You don't need to feel like you're stuck between one or the other. And you can also say so many people, whether they build or buy guns, they will swap out parts anyway. So to an extent, you're already already doing that, if that makes sense. So we've talked about building versus buying, and so let's put all this together to see what it looks like in the real world. Let's take an example of an M16A4 that you're considering building versus buying, because this is a really good example of something that you actually can buy very easily, but also one you can build very easily. And we're going to talk about price as well to illustrate the example that it's not necessarily always cheaper to choose one method over the other. So for example number 1, let's say you have an Aero Precision rifle here. And now I know you used to be able to buy the entire complete rifle, but I couldn't find it this time. So for the sake of this example, let's just say that buying the upper, lower, bulkier group and charging handle is considered to be buying your rifle, because there's no real assembly needed for this. You just put the parts together. So here you can see that if you add up the MSRP of all of them, it's about $1,100 or so. Now let's compare that to a building example of the exact same gun functionally, which is what you're actually seeing here on the screen. This is my BCM clone that I have A2 furniture on it. So we're comparing functionally, again, the same gun. You can see here in this case that building actually turns out to be a little bit more expensive, but ultimately that's because of the cost of tools that you will see here. Now, if you have all these tools lying around, you could make the argument that it's basically the exact same cost, but you will notice still you have to buy more individual parts to put the same gun together in the end. So in this example, based on how you look at it, either building is more expensive or it's roughly the same price based on whether you have the tools or not. Now let's look at a second example, still using the M16A4, but this time we want to use the version that has the Knight's Armament Picatinny rail in the front as opposed to traditional A2 furniture. Again, we're choosing this one because this exact configuration can be built pretty easily, which is actually what you're seeing on the screen. I built it. Or you can buy it very easily. Specifically, the FN military collector is a M16A4. So you can see the price of the FN is noticeably more than if you were to just build the rifle. And while they are not actually the same parts, functionally, this is an identical rifle, so it is, in my opinion, a one-to-one comparison. Now, there is an intangible benefit towards the FN Military Collector's Edition, which is that it has that nostalgia and it has that clone correctness, at least as close as a civilian can get to the military version of the M16A4. That is a pretty big selling point of this gun, which is also probably why it costs a little more, versus if you were to build one like mine, they're using parts that aren't necessarily used by the military. Some people care about that when they build these things, some people don't. I obviously do not, but that's also a consideration that's more intangible. But you can also see that the guns are basically the same, other than maybe some of the parts lists and things like that. But in this example, building your gun is cheaper than buying it, which is contrary to our first example. Also, even though I have a flashlight on my gun here on the screen, I did not include that into the price. So I'm hoping all of this was helpful. You have considerations for why you might build versus buy, and then you also have, real world examples of how price can be, very flexible depending on what you do and what you choose. There are situations like we just looked at where buying might be more expensive, but buying also might be cheaper depending on a few scenarios. So at the end of the day, I don't really think one is better than the other. I personally err more towards building your gun because I think it really gives you the opportunity to learn more about how does the gun work, how do I put it together, and just having the knowledge of what the different components are and maybe what's critical, and therefore what do I need to take care of a little more when I maintain my gun. I think those things ultimately make it a better experience, but yes, you do have to put in some time and patience up front or throughout the whole process. But once you get the hang of it, it is very fun. I would say it becomes a whole experience. When you buy your gun, you think about, oh, you're just waiting for it to ship to your door, or not to your door. Can't do that. Ship to the gun store and do the paperwork and all that good stuff. Though when you build your gun, you could say you're doing all the research up, ahead of time. And it's a lot of fun to be able to, do all of that. It's exciting, but it's frustrating because you want your parts now, but you also want the process to continue. So I'm nerding out here a bit, but the point is that it can be a really fun and also a very productive experience too, if you learn how to build your guns. But I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a better method. It just is a different method to achieve the same end goal that I think has some considerations that you should choose. So that'll do it for this video, guys. Now I want to go shoot my M16. Don't know if I'll get to the range today, but whoa, look at this guy. Love it. We have the MaTech rear backup sight here, which I showed, in that cost breakdown. But that thing looks sexy. I'll definitely put the ACOG back on it anyway. Or I might do the carry handle. Who knows? I find these days I have more of an itch to shoot iron sights. So we'll see. But anyway, hope you guys found this helpful. Let me know if you have any questions or if you think there's anything to also be considered. I'll catch you guys in the next one. See you later.